Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It is Miss Gooding, and I'm here with part two of the Gilded Age. Remember that gilded, the term gilded means covered with gold. And Mark Twain kind of came up with this term to describe this period of history, which is about during the Civil War through the early 1900s, as gilded simply because everything looked great and shiny from the outside, but it was full of corruption and greed and poverty on the inside. And so, hence, we have the Gilded Age as a nickname for this time period. Um, the section of this lecture, part two, that I'm going to be going over is specifically about the corruption and greed that permeated this time period. Remember from lecture one, I did talk about the rise of industry and how successful many of the people who were working in steel and oil and coal were during this time, and they made a significant amount of money and they made significant impacts. However, it was pretty unequal when it came to the people who owned the businesses versus the people who worked in the factories. And so I'm going to go into that a little bit more right now. So there was a concept called the bosses of the Senate. And if you take a look at this political cartoon, you have all sorts of big, overweight guys sitting up here. And this is, steel, the steel trust, the copper trust, Standard Oil, all of these industries that represent, that they're greedy, they're gluttonous, they're looking over. And these here are the senators. And so you have these rich oil tycoons and these steel entrepreneurs that are making sure that the bosses or that the senators are doing what their biting is, right? And so this represents the political corruption of the time. That the industries had a lot of say over the policies and our government institutions. So there was something called the political patronage or political spoil system. And this was a part of the corruption and the systematic corruption that was going on in America during this time. So the political spoil system was really essentially dispersing jobs, not based on merit, not based on ability, but based on scratching one another's backs. And so it was in return for votes, or it was in return for a favor. And so a lot of the political leaders at the time, saw themselves as needing favors, or vice versa, the industries would need favors. And so they would do these favors for each other. And then the political, people in political office would appoint these people that, they owed favors to as a part of their cabinet in some cases. And so it wasn't necessarily that we were getting the best person for the job, it was the best person for the favor that needed to be filled. And so that was a layer of corruption that started to be identified later on during the Gilded Age that people were not happy about. Another type of corruption that was happening were the political machines. And the political machines were people going into specifically, for example, poor areas and asking immigrants for their votes, and then returning or telling them that they would then do favors for them, like help them improve their homes or housing situations, or help them, find childcare, or, something that would help them in some aspect of their lives. But in return, those individuals needed to promise to vote for them. And so those were, two different types of corruption that were happening that were going unchecked largely during the Gilded Age. Eventually, due to the assassination of James Garfield, the Pendleton Act was passed in 1883. The Pendleton Act put an end to specifically the spoils system, and it made it compulsory for you to show and prove that you had the skills in order to do the job that you were elected for, or appointed for, or placed in. And it also made campaign contributions illegal from federal employees. And so that kind of put a stop to those types of corruptive moves. And again, it also made gaining the job based on merit, which is still in place today. This is a little bit more about how the political machine works. And so let's just, you could probably start at any point in this chart, but we'll start up here. So residents, actually, let's start on the right-hand side. So a machine maintains power over city governments, but they do so by political machines work to control city policies. And they are often run by a boss and who has a lot of control over municipal officials, so city officials. The machine hands out jobs, contracts, favors to city residents, and then these residents vote for their candidates supported by the political machines, because the political machine then tells them, hey, for this favor, you are going to vote for this candidate. And then it just kind of goes around and around. And so we end over here again with the machine maintaining power over the city government. And so that was, it was just something that was really, really common during this time. People not really running fair campaigns, people not really, looking for the best candidate. They were like looking for what would make their lives easier and how and who could do that for them. And then deals were made. One of the biggest and most famous bosses during this time was Boss Tweed. So he was a ringleader of the Tweed Ring, and he lived in New York City. So he plundered millions of dollars from New York City by running a political machine. He held lots of government offices, including he held one term as a New York senator. And, by 1860, he was already in full control, and he really ran Tammany Hall. And what Tammany Hall is, it's the organization, or it's the building where the executive committee of the Democratic Party met. And so Boss Tweed took over, and he kind of, he was the henchman basically for Tammany Hall, and he was able to pass many city ordinances to benefit himself and the people around him. And he did so by, convincing people to vote in a certain way, but he also was able to create fake leases, fake vouchers, in order to make money and to gain political power. And eventually, people kind of called him on his bluff. There was a specific journalist named Thomas Nast, and Thomas Nast was a journalist, and he was he created political cartoons as well, and he really focused on bringing Boss Tweed down. And so Nast, like I said, he was a journalist for Harper's Weekly. And over a period of time, he tried to expose Tweed's massive corruption in New York. And eventually, people started to investigate, and they ended up finding him guilty of some of his corruptive tactics. And this led to his political demise and his arrest in 1876. Boss Tweed did not last very long in prison. He only lasted for about a year and a half, and then he died alone and in prison. So, but he is an example of a massive corruptive man during this time. One of the other things that was going on that was a result of corruption and greed were a lot of the federal land grants and subsidies. So, as you recall, the Transcontinental Railroad was a major deal during this time period. And with the explosion and the increase in manufacturing steel, it was easier and easier to build it quickly. So there were multiple companies working on building this transatlantic railroad across the country. So in 1862, I've talked about this before, but in 1862, the Pacific Railroad Act was passed. And this Railroad Act of 1862, this was done in the middle of the Civil War under Abraham Lincoln. It gave the government millions of acres of land, of federal land, in order to build this railroad. And instead of giving this land and parceling it out to people and to families and to farmers, like they had done in the past with the Homestead Act, the Pacific Railroad Act actually made the government, it enabled them to give this land instead to railroad companies. And people were not happy about that, and so the subsidies started coming through, and these subsidies really kind of blended the role of the government and the role of private businesses. And these land grants and the money that came from owning this land from the railroad companies ended up being a problem. And you'll see in just a second because I'll explain that. So there was a massive scandal in between 1872 and 1873, partially because of these subsidies that were going on with the railroad companies. And it was called the Credit Mobilier scandal. So basically, the land had been given, and the railroad companies were supposedly using this land. But the stockholders in the Union Pacific Railroad, they formed a company called the Credit Mobilier of America. And it gave contracts to build, it was given contracts to build the Transcontinental Railroad. Okay, fine. That happened a lot. In order to make some money, they sold shares and made a ton of money. And they sold some of these shares even to congressmen. Which probably wasn't quite right at the time either. But the congressmen ended up approving these subsidies, and these subsidies went through. And these subsidies aided the railroad companies, of course. But the railroad companies, in turn, grossly overcharged the government. These railroad companies and the managers of these companies knew how much things would cost, but they hiked the prices and ended up overcharging the government. And the government probably either was not checking very closely, or they weren't paying attention, or there were congressmen that were like, hey, we have a share in this company anyway, so we don't really want to rock the boat. And so the government was being swindled out of money by this scandal. They were able to make incredibly huge profits off of their greed and off of their corruption. And it was taxpayers and the government that ended up footing the bill. So that was, an obvious example of major corruption. So a little bit about the Gilded Age politics of the time. So again, the Gilded Age, some people believe, started in 1862 with the Pacific Railroad Act, because it was the blending of government subsidies specifically and private businesses and private enterprise. Some people put it at the very end of the Civil War. Some people put it at the end of Reconstruction. So there's a lot of, kind of gray area here with the Gilded Age. But regardless, the Gilded Age politics, there was a high percentage of voter participation. 80% turned out for elections compared to 50% or lower today. Mostly white men, because remember, women were not allowed to vote. And also the vote was so new for African Americans that there was still a lot of sabotage and probably intimidation at the polls. Also literacy rates and poll taxes were a problem. So mostly white men showed up. But on election day, there were a lot of parties and parades and days off of work, so that people had a lot of time and focus on these elections. So supposedly the Congress was stronger than today's Congress. Presidents were not as strong and maybe not seen as often as they would be today. And that's just a little bit of a difference, just to kind of keep in mind. There were Republicans and Democrats, and the Republican Party was starting to become the Republican Party that it is today. That the Republican Party was now focused on the economy, strong tariffs, and then also the moral and public virtue issues. Okay, whereas the Democratic Party was focused mainly on supporting immigrants and workers' rights. And so we see now that these two parties are now becoming more and more similar to what we know of as the Republican and Democrat Party today. Presidents of the Gilded Age, these are kind of some presidents that may not be as popular as Washington and Adams and Jackson and Lincoln, but they were significant in their own way. So we have Ulysses S. Grant, who was post-Civil War and during Reconstruction. Rutherford B. Hayes, which, remember, he won over Samuel Tilden in a backdoor agreement which ended Reconstruction. James Garfield, who was assassinated. Chester A. Arthur, Grover Cleveland. And Grover Cleveland, interestingly enough, was the only president that was elected twice. So he served from 1885 to 1889, and then again in 1893 to 1897. So that's kind of interesting. Benjamin Harrison, and then William McKinley, who was also assassinated. So there were a couple of assassinations during this time period. Presidential politics. So I've already kind of gone over this a little bit, but from 1877 to 1896, people just kind of see these presidents as a parade of faceless presidents. Not that they weren't significant, but there's not a lot that stands out, like the Civil War, or the acquiring of the entire state of Utah. I mean, there's nothing that really stands out significantly about these presidents per se. So I want to talk a little bit about how the spoils system ended and how we got to the place where the Pendleton Act in 1883 was able to be established. So remember that the spoils system, earlier in the lecture, I mentioned that the spoils system was offering and promising jobs to people in order to get their vote or get favors, right? And so James Garfield had only been president for 4 months. The spoils system was going strong. There was a man named Charles Guiteau. Charles Guiteau thought that he should be Garfield's, I think, ambassador to France or something like that. And yeah, the minister to France, it's in my notes here. And and when Garfield would not appoint him, Charles Guiteau got a little annoyed. He tracked James Garfield down at a train station, and he ended up shooting Garfield at this train station. And unfortunately, at the train station, there were some doctors that came by, but they didn't have the medical equipment that they needed, and they didn't really do a very good job. And so at the train station, there were a couple of doctors that were putting their hands inside Garfield's wounds. And about 80 days later, Garfield ended up dying of infection and a really painful death. So his death was preventable, sadly enough. If they would have known more about germ theory back in the day, they probably would have been able to save his life. But it goes without saying that, wash your hands, right? So Garfield was assassinated. And because of his assassination, the Pendleton Act was heavily supported. And so the Pendleton Act, again, established civil service using worker credentials instead of favoritism, okay? Which may have also saved Garfield's life had it been in place. We've already talked about the Compromise of 1877, but very, very quickly, at the very end of Reconstruction, we have Samuel Tilden, who was a Democrat, and Rutherford B. Hayes, who was a Republican. The election was exceptionally close. The results were within, a point or two electorally. And so to finalize the votes, they made some backdoor agreements. The Democrats allowed Hayes to be president as long as the following conditions were met. So number one, they wanted to restore independent governments in the South. And so the governments wanted to be able to have their own say. They wanted to be able to elect their own people. And they didn't want the North kind of hanging over and making sure that they were doing it in the way that the North wanted. Second thing is that they wanted all federal troops removed that were stationed in the South. And remember that these troops were stationed in the South to really protect the Freedmen's Bureau and to establish a safe living environment for newly freedmen, the African Americans of the time. Another thing that a condition of allowing Hayes to become president was that they wanted additional federal subsidies in order to complete the railroad in the South. And remember that the railroads were incredibly important during this time because they were able to get goods and services and people quickly from one place to the other, which helped the economy. And during the Civil War, Lincoln had focused on building railroads in the North, but not the South. So the South was lagging behind, and so this was a part of their agreement. And this election officially ended Reconstruction, sadly enough. A lot of historians say that Reconstruction ended too soon. But this compromise between these two men and their parties was called the Compromise of 1877. All right, and that ends my part 2 Gilded Age lecture. I hope that you learned a lot about the corruption and greed during the time. Thank you for listening. And my next one will be the Gilded Age part 3 about race and racism during the Gilded Age.